I'm going to dive into Chapter 6 for the lecture that we missed last week due to the snow and the ice. Again, I'm sorry for not being at my full potential right now. Still a little bit under the weather, and hopefully it won't be too bad or too scratchy on here. And then tomorrow night when we meet again, I'll send you the actual links or the actual slides along with this recorded lecture. So we're finally at the sixth and final element that is needed when talking about or assessing whether or not we have a valid contract. So we had offer, acceptance, consideration, legal subject matter, and contractual capacity. So we've had those 5 so far, and we've covered each of those. Now we're finally at the sixth and final element, which is contractual intent. So again, we'll just rehash what that means, and then we'll talk about concepts that undermine contractual intent, including fraud and misrepresentation, and we will discuss the differences between those two, the concept of duress, and what is meant by undue influence, and how those can impact someone's intent in entering into a contract. We'll define a contract of adhesion and discuss the effects of a mistake on contract formation. And even within that category, there's 2 subsets of mutual mistake and unilateral mistake. So we'll talk about all of these concepts and how they relate to contractual intent, and how if there's a lack of intent that may be used to seek to avoid a contract. So again, just to redefine this concept, which we have talked about in prior classes, contractual intent is, we have to have that, and that's evidenced by the parties entering into an agreement, a relationship for the same, under the same terms. So again, we have this meeting of the minds. When they're entering into a contract for the same bargain at the same time, everyone's on the same page and everyone's serious about it. When we want to look at how to prove contractual intent, the circumstances will be very, very important, especially if someone is disputing intent. So it will be fact-specific in every case, and we'll look at the words of the parties, the actions of the parties, the relationship between the parties. And keep in mind, as we talked about in a prior example, someone who is, joking around may be considered to not have the proper contractual intent. So just to illustrate that, and there was a prior example we talked about, but if you look at page 128 of your book, at the bottom of that page, it says, Susan and John have been friends since childhood. Susan has to turn in a book report for school tomorrow and asks John to come to her house to help her. To induce his promise, Susan offers him $10,000 for his help, and John laughingly accepts. Clearly, under these circumstances, using these facts, there is no contract. With these facts, we would look at the fact that they're friends, that John laughed when accepting it, and there was no intent by either party to actually be bound by that. So anytime you're assessing contractual intent, once again, the facts really do matter. Now, to move on to fraud, there are 5 critical elements when we're talking about contractual fraud. There has to have been a misrepresentation of a material fact made with the intent to deceive and relied upon by the other party to his or her detriment. All 5 elements have to be present to establish contractual fraud. And this is important because if someone is saying that they were fraudulently induced into entering into a contract, they're making a very serious charge against the other party. Not a criminal charge of any kind, but still very serious nonetheless. essentially claiming that the other party deceived them in some way. So what it's alleging is that the fraudulent party, or the party committing fraud, had an ill intent in getting the other party to enter into the contract. When we talk about element number 2, which is of a material fact, what's important there is that the fact has to go to the heart of the transaction. Really has to be critical in terms of what the contract is all about. So again, the facts will matter in any of these situations. But what this seeks, or what a claim of fraud would seek to accomplish, is to void a contract by saying, I didn't have the intent to enter into this contract, knowingly or voluntarily, because I was fraudulently induced into entering into it. Excuse me. So the innocent party in a fraudulent contract is given the power to void the contract if he or she wants. This is similar to when we talked about capacity, how a party that lacks capacity to enter into a contract has the power to void the contract, makes the contract voidable. And if and when that party regains capacity, he or she can decide, you know what, I'll stay in this. I now choose to ratify this contract to make it valid by, waiving that right to void it. And so that is similar to this concept here of fraud, in that the innocent party is the one that holds the power to do away with the contract, to void it. But the innocent party also holds the power to proceed with the contract if he or she so chooses. Now, if there is no deceit and it's simply an innocent misrepresentation of a fact, even a material fact, this would just be considered a misrepresentation. But the innocent party still has the same power to void the contract if he or she wants. So when we talk about a material fact, let's take a look at the example starting on page 129 of your book. Number 1, Paul is walking down the street when he sees a man selling watches. The man tells Paul that the watches are Cartier's and offers to sell him one for $50. Paul buys the watch, but 2 days later it breaks. He brings the watch to a licensed Cartier dealer for repairs and discovers that the watch is not a Cartier, but a cheap imitation. So if Paul can ever find that man on the street again, he can get his money back. Because in this situation, Paul was buying the watch under the impression that it was, in fact, an expensive watch, a well-made, watch with a great reputation. When in fact it was not that at all. It was a piece of junk that broke within 2 days. So because of these facts, Paul was induced to enter into the contract to buy the watch by fraud. The man lied about the subject matter, and that was really the only, under these facts, what the book's telling us is that was why Paul bought the watch. Now, if Paul, I guess if the facts were to establish that Paul didn't really care either way and he thought $50 was a good deal for a watch and he wasn't buying it, based on the fact that it was a Cartier, just like the watch, that, that may kind of undermine his case. He's probably, I guess, in those circumstances, unlikely to make a claim of fraud because he would have wanted the watch anyway. But even still, he probably could still get his money back, even if perhaps, and then it may just have been, it's still a misrepresentation, but in that situation, if Paul wasn't necessarily induced solely because of the Cartier element of it, maybe that would be some sort of defense that the man on the street might make. But again, all of this is fact specific and then is left to a court to decide what is the appropriate remedy based upon the facts. Okay, on page 130 of your book, to continue with the examples, just to illustrate this point. Number 2, Lola is in the market for a Van Gogh painting. Now, Charles is an art dealer, and he is selling a painting that is said to be Van Gogh, even though he has not bothered to check its origins. So he doesn't really know either way whether it is or is not a Van Gogh. Charles then sells the painting to Lola, who discovers that the painting is a forgery. Under these very specific facts, this would be a misrepresentation. Now, Charles was negligent in not establishing the genuineness of the painting, but he did not have an intent to deceive Lola. So there's no mistake because the genuineness of the painting could have been checked had Charles not been careless. So in this situation, Lola can get her money back because even though he didn't have an intent to deceive, there was a misrepresentation of a material fact. It was portrayed as if this was a Van Gogh when it was in fact not a Van Gogh. So it's not as if Charles was mistaken. He just didn't take the proper steps to verify the claim either way. So again, the remedy is still the same. Excuse me, sorry. Lola would be able to get her money back and get out of this contract. Okay. And in the final example, just another example of fraud. In a recent trial decision, a man sued his ex-wife for fraud. After many years of marriage, she admitted to him that she had never loved him. So after the divorce, the former husband sued the wife for fraud in the marriage contract and won. It was found that the wife purposely misled the husband by saying that she loved him in order to induce the marriage. This constitutes a fraud because marriage is a contract. The detriment to the husband suffered was the property the wife acquired from him during the marriage. So, again, it doesn't really flesh out exactly what he got back in terms of, did he get the actual property back? Did he get just the monetary value awarded to him? It's not fleshed out, but it does, provide another example of fraud in that sense. I'm sorry. And I apologize, I cannot get these emails to disappear. But a party, an innocent party, one who has been wronged either by fraud or misrepresentation, will be entitled to remedies under contractual law. If that person so chooses, again, giving that party, the innocent party, the power to void the contract if he or she so chooses. So that's fraud. And again, going through this, if you have any questions about any of these, write them down. We will go over them in class. We'll certainly cover any questions you have prior to the taking of your test for chapters 5 through 8. Now, duress in general is some form of force or coercion exercised over one party to the contract in order to induce that party's promise to enter into the contract. And this can be physical, it can be mental, there can also be economic duress. So we're going to, talk about the different types here. It can be emotional duress, which, might also fall under mental as well in some situations. An easy example of physical duress would be the example that's provided for starting on page 130 of your book. Bill holds a gun to Morris's head and tells him to sign a contract deeding over Blackacre, which is property, to Bill for a stated price. There is no contract here. Morris, even if he signs this, was forced to sign the contract at gunpoint. So he did not freely intend to enter into this contract, and he would not be bound to enter into it. But the thing to keep in mind here is, again, how is this going to be proven? If Morris is going to make that claim that he entered into this contract only at gunpoint, how might that how would he prove that? Would he have video of that? Would he have any sort of other evidence other than just his word? So this concept exists, and certainly it allows for parties to claim that the contract is invalid under these circumstances, but proving it may be another thing entirely. And that's just something to keep in the back of your mind when we talk about these concepts. As I said, there's another form of duress, which would be economic duress. So this would be where someone is forced into an arrangement under the threat of losing some monetary benefit. So for example, before workers had protections in terms of their job and workers' rights, unions that might protect certain workers from abuse by their employers and their bosses. A boss turning to an employee and saying, if you don't come in Sunday, don't bother coming in Monday, that provides for an employee to be in a no-win situation. Well, I need this job. I need, to be able to come back to this work on my next scheduled day, which would have been Monday, but now I'm being forced to come in on Sunday to do whatever's being required of me. So again, just a very, I would love to say that it's not as prevalent anymore. It is still prevalent. I do have a number of clients who, just by virtue of the type of business they're in, have to work 7 days, and they don't get a say in that. And if they want a job, that's what they have to do. They, it doesn't always necessarily fall under, like their best remedy, I guess I would say, would not necessarily be contractual. It might perhaps be in the employment law realm. But nevertheless, it's a similar concept that they're not really doing this because they want to work 7 days a week. It's because they feel as though they have no other choice. There is an element of economic duress that is being pressed upon them. An example of this, another example of this is on page 131 of your book. Iris received a letter from her state tax department stating that she has underpaid her taxes and orders an audit of her returns. Now, under the state law, the tax department can only audit returns for the previous 3 years. When Iris goes to the audit, the agent tells her that if she doesn't sign a waiver permitting an audit of all of her previous returns, he will order all of her assets frozen under a final determination of her until a final determination of her tax liability is made. Under that pressure, Iris signs the waiver, meaning that all of her prior returns are up for audit and up for review and could potentially cost her a lot of money if it was determined that she underpaid for more than just those past 3 years. So I hope you can see in this situation, she was being forced to sign a waiver that allowed the state to have way more authority than it actually had. In doing so, opening herself up to potential serious financial risk. But, the flip side of that was if she didn't sign that waiver and open herself up to that risk, all of her current assets would be frozen. So that could really harm her in the short term financially, whereas she's opening herself up to this potential long-term financial hardship. It's again, something that would have to be proven based on the circumstances. But in a case like that, especially with the state law, which very clearly would say that, they can only go back 3 years, Iris would probably have a very good case of getting out of that waiver and not being subject to audit for older tax years. And the final type of duress that actually carries that word, a type of duress is mental duress. Like I said, I also think psychological, emotional, those kind of fall under this category. And this is when a person is coerced to enter into a contract by psychological threats. So there's nothing physical. Their money isn't necessarily threatened. It's just, it's fact specific. It's a case by case determination, but there is some other pressure that is being put on the person that, they're fearful. Maybe they're fearful of their safety, even though there's no immediate physical threat, or fearful of the safety of someone else that they love, or, fearful of information being revealed upon them, revealed about them, some other type of psychological threat. So in that case, if someone is induced into entering into a contract under mental duress, they would have the power to invalidate or void that contract if they can prove mental duress. When we think about mental duress, it is really important to keep in mind the relationship of the parties. And when when mental duress is exercised by someone who is close to or in a close relationship with the innocent party, the one who's being pressured, we call this undue influence. And undue influence is, again, just a subset of mental duress that takes into consideration that very close relationship between the parties. So if we look at example number 1 on page 131, this will help to emphasize this. Maxwell is 92 years old and he lives in a nursing home. The owner of the home, the nursing home, convinces Maxwell to sign over all of his property to the home in consideration of giving all the loving care the home gives him. This contract is clearly invalid because it was induced by the undue influence of the owner of the home, over Maxwell. If you think about it in a number of different ways, the nursing home is getting paid for the services it provides to Maxwell. So they already have to provide care to him. Maybe not loving care by virtue of, what the state requires and what the nursing home guidelines would require. Nevertheless, the nursing home already has an obligation to Maxwell. So to then use that relationship and that authority over him in that way, and if you think about it, it really does kind of have an undercurrent of a threat, as to say, well, if you don't turn over this property to us, we will not provide loving care to you. Certainly, I think someone in Maxwell's position could interpret that to mean that harm might come to him. So that would be an example of undue influence that would invalidate the contract, because Maxwell in this situation did not have the intent to actually turn over the property were it not for that threat being imposed upon him. Another example, if you turn to page 132 of your book, Mary and David are getting divorced. David convinces Mary to sign a joint custody agreement for their 3 children by threatening to take the children out of the country if she refuses. Assuming that Mary signs that joint custody agreement, because of course she doesn't want her children being taken out of the country, that contract is unenforceable. It's invalid. If she had felt as if she had no choice but to enter into that contract because she was under mental duress, and again, undue influence here by David. Okay. And then just to tie in fraud as well, let's look at example number 3 on page 132. Hilda is 80 years old and frail. A real estate developer convinces her to sell her house by telling her that, because of her frail health, the state is going to take her house away and put her in a home. Not only is this mental duress because she's being threatened in this way that would cause her great emotional and mental stress by thinking she's going to lose her home, coupled with the fact that she's otherwise frail. So certainly her physical health probably plays into how she's perceiving this mental threat. But not only that, it's a false statement, and it goes to the heart of the transfer of property. So it's not only a mental duress situation, but it's also fraud. So this is very, very much, very easily an invalid contract here. Okay. Again, any questions you have, write them down and we'll discuss them in class. Okay. Now, a contract of adhesion is where there isn't any actual duress. It falls under the category of duress, but there's no actual physical, emotional, mental, psychological, or economic duress. But there's such an uneven bargaining power between the parties that, and again, it depends on the contract, what the facts of the contract are. But if someone were to look at it and say, wait a minute, this is the arrangement between these two parties, one who has a lot of power and one who has no power, no, there's no way that this was a valid contract. There's no way that the party with the little to no power actually had the intention of entering into this arrangement. Excuse me. So these types of contracts are not inherently void, but they are voidable by the innocent party if that party, decides, I really can't, I really never wanted to be in this, but I felt as though I had no power to bargain against the other party. So I think a good way to illustrate this is with the examples here in the book, starting on page 132. Number 1, Leo lives in a small town, and there's only one car dealership within a 100-mile radius. When Leo is talked into buying a car for several $1,000s more than he wanted to spend, the contract may be deemed a contract of adhesion because if Leo really wants a car, he doesn't have any other choice. The dealer is in an unfair bargaining position. If Leo really wants to press the issue, he may be able to void the contract, especially if he finds a way to get to another car dealer 100 miles out. But just think about that. This car dealer has all the power. This is the only business of this type in town and within a long, range of the area. So not that condoning this, but this car dealer may decide, wow, this gives me a great position to take advantage of folks and charge whatever I want, because if they need a car, I'm the only guy who can offer it. And the flip side of that, if you think about it, is if there's competition, that tends to drive prices down. If you've ever been in a corner where there's several gas stations, they tend to compete with one another as to who's offering the best price, so people will come there and buy their gas. Okay. The next example on page 132, number 2, Silvio, having put on a few pounds over the last several years, walks into a health club to inquire about joining. The club salesman, a powerfully built young man, walks Silvio around the facility, takes him into his office, and tells him about a special deal, only available for that one day. So if Silvio signs up right now, he'll save $300. If he doesn't sign up immediately, though, he'll lose the opportunity altogether. The salesman then tells Silvio that he's not getting any younger, so the longer he waits, the harder it's going to be to take off that weight. Now, hearing all of this, Silvio signs up for a 3-year membership, but immediately regrets it. This is a contract of adhesion, again, because the fitness club, the man at the health club, has all this bargaining power, can say, I can offer you this fantastic deal, but it is a take it or leave it proposition, and excuse me, you have to go for it now or lose all other deals that I can offer you. So because of this aggressive salesmanship, Silvio was put in a position of not really having a chance to weigh his options, to say, well, let me go look at some other places, or let me hold off and wait and see if you offer any other deals. He, under these circumstances, Silvio would be able to avoid this contract, to void the contract if he wanted to. And the book also notes that be aware that a number of states have special consumer protection laws that specifically deal with health club memberships in light of techniques like this. So he may not only have a remedy under contract law, but also under state law. Again, it's one of those situations where sometimes there's additional protections for people beyond just under contract law. And the final example to illustrate a contract of adhesion is number 3 on page 133. Wanda, the wistful widow of Winnetka, wants to put more fun in her life, so she signs up for dance lessons. Her instructor is young and handsome, and his name is Raul. After an initial 10 sessions are over, Raul convinces Wanda to sign up for the advanced course because of her great dance potential. Halfway through the advanced course, Wanda attends a community dance where all of her partners comment on how badly she danced. Wanda sues to get her money back from the dance school. Under these facts, Wanda will prevail. Because of Raul's perceived expertise, he convinced her that she was doing a great job and that, she was going to be able to, advance if she signed up for the next course. So, he enticed her to, under, also somewhat false circumstances, but, he used his unfair power and his reputation and his knowledge and his expertise to induce her into entering into this contract for the advanced course. So this would be a contract of adhesion. Okay. So again, let me know if you have any questions about contracts of adhesion. And the final concept is mistake. So it starts on page 133 of your book. A mistake occurs when one or both of the parties is under a misconception as to the subject matter of the contract. So we have 2 categories. We have mutual mistake and unilateral mistake. A mutual mistake is one that goes to a basic assumption of the agreement and it has a material adverse effect on the parties, and it was the type that could not be foreseen. So this means, all of the parties to the contract are mistaken as to this critical part of the contract. And if there is in fact a mutual mistake, then it is a defense to the formation of the contract. The contract is void. Whereas a unilateral mistake concerns a situation in which only one party to the contract is mistaken because of some typewritten or computation error. And in this situation, it renders that mistaken party, the innocent party, gives that person the power to render the contract voidable. So let's go through the examples to take a look at these. Starting on page 133, number 1. Sheila and Kathleen enter into a contract for the sale of Sheila's summer house, but unknown to both parties, the house has been destroyed by a hurricane. So in this situation, there is no contract because the basic assumption of the contract was that the house was still standing, that the house had not been destroyed by the contract. But here, both parties are mistaken. So Sheila would not be able to force Kathleen to buy a destroyed home or the remnants of a home on this land because the house was the main basic part, the critical part of the contract, and there was a mistake about that house being still in existence. So that is not a valid contract. Number 2, and this is on page 134. Edward agrees to lease some property to Eve so that Eve can operate a retail store at that location. Unknown to both Edward and Eve, the town council passes a zoning ordinance restricting the use of the area in question to residential use only. There is no contract here. Both parties are mistaken with respect to the basic assumption underlying the agreement, which is that the property could be used for commercial purposes. So this would be another example of a mutual mistake. And there's what the parties intended to do with the property cannot be done anymore. So this would be this would invalidate the formation of this contract. So to contrast that, the example further down on page 134 is an example of a unilateral mistake. Arnold submits a contracting bid to Ace Incorporated for the construction of a warehouse. Arnold makes a mistake in computing his expenses, and the bid turns out to be $2,000 lower than it should be. Now, Ace accepts this erroneous bid, this bid that's lower than it really should be. There is a contract. This is an example of a unilateral mistake in which Ace, the innocent party, has no way of knowing that that Arnold has miscalculated his bid. They don't know. They're relying on Arnold to assess the, run all the specs and provide the quote. So Ace is not committing Ace isn't being deceitful. Ace isn't, doesn't know that this is a mistake and is trying to continue lowballing him or anything like that. So a valid contract exists here. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if Arnold had in his bid itemized all of his expenses and all of the itemized totals, all of the different lines would have added up to a higher number. But for some reason, the total at the bottom was incorrect just because of some sort of typo. There would be no contract because Ace could have seen the mistake simply by doing the totals itself. And, because if you think about it, if Arnold had realized his error before Ace had accepted and he notified Ace, Ace would not have accepted the low bid because it would have been aware of the error. Just to kind of go back to the first part of that example, it's kind of coming at an interesting time for me. I'm having some work done in my home, and it's specifically painting, and it is turning out, I think, to be a much bigger project than the painters may have thought. I mean, certainly just the time that they originally quoted, it has gone on much, much longer. So, but I'm not a painter. I don't know for sure how long any of these things are supposed to take. I don't know how many workers they had in mind when they quoted this to me, but I am only going to be bound to the amount that I agreed to pay when I signed the contract. Even if the actual man hours at this point take a lot longer than what was originally intended, that's on them. That is on the painting company. That would be a unilateral mistake on their part, and I'm certainly not going to be inclined to let them out of it or pay more simply because maybe they miscalculated. So just to kind of float that out there from this end, there is a valid contract there. I am only still responsible for paying what was quoted to me because the work that was quoted is in fact being done, even if perhaps they underbid. I had a similar situation recently where my homeowner community was getting quotes for a landscaping to be done, let's say starting this April, when we start the spring and summer season. And the landscapers that we used last year submitted a quote that was way higher than what we paid last year. And the reason for that was, we really underbid last year. So knowing that, they corrected it, and they knew they couldn't overcharge us last year. They just realized that they kind of took a loss on the contract because it was a valid contract. We paid for the services rendered, but realizing that they'd underbid us significantly, they upped their bid very significantly this year. And in light of that, we did not go with them, but they realized their unilateral mistake for last year and tried to correct it this year. Okay. Just to flesh out mistake a little bit more, there's an interplay between this concept of mistake and when we talked in chapter 2 about the terms not being certain or definite. Because if terms are not certain and they're not definite, then that may lend itself towards there being a mistake about some critical part of the contract. And if there are ambiguities in a contract, the party who drafts the contract in that ambiguous way is the one that will kind of take the heat for that, for lack of a better term. Meaning, if there's an ambiguity, that it's held against the party who drafted the contract. The thought there being the person who drafted the contract should be in the best position to have drafted it clearly and did not, so the party that didn't draft it shouldn't be the one that takes the hit. To just try to clear up this last point before the end of the chapter, if we look at the examples on page 135, I think this will maybe help flesh this out a little bit. So, example number 1. Sophie offers to sell Lindsay a blue stone she has in her possession for $100. Sophie thinks the stone is just a blue quartz. Lindsay thinks the stone is a sapphire. So Lindsay thinks, wow, this could be really valuable. I'm going to agree to buy this. She agrees to the contract. Later, Lindsay discovers the stone is a blue quartz, so she wants her money back, claiming she was mistaken as to the object of the contract. Now, Lindsay, she was mistaken. She thought it was something more valuable than it was. But in this case, the contract is valid because all they contracted for was the sale of a blue stone. So Sophie never attempted to mislead Lindsay. She never told her it was a sapphire. She never said what it was really. She just said a blue stone. The fact that Lindsay turned out to be mistaken as to its value is irrelevant. Again, this goes back to let the buyer beware. If Lindsay wanted to have done more research, she could have, but she didn't. She chose to enter into this agreement, and now she's going to be bound to it, whether she likes it or not. Let's contrast that, however, with the next example, which is Sophie offers to sell Lindsay a blue stone, and she designates it as a blue quartz. She says, I have this blue quartz. Do you want to buy it for $100? And Lindsay also thinks it's a blue quartz, and she says, yeah, I'd love to have that. That sounds great. That stone's beautiful. I'll buy it for $100. Later, Lindsay finds out that the stone is actually a sapphire, and it's worth $10,000. In this situation, this would be an invalid contract, or a contract that would be voided. In Sophie's mind, she sold a blue quartz. And in Lindsay's mind, she bought a blue quartz, when in fact there was a mutual mistake. Sophie sold a blue sapphire, and that's what Lindsay bought. So in these circumstances, since the contract specified the blue quartz, the contract would not be enforceable. If you think about it, the way that would develop would be Lindsay would find out it's a sapphire. Somehow then Sophie would find out it's a sapphire, and Sophie would be the one trying to get the stone back and invalidate the contract. I know the example doesn't really kind of get into the logistics of that, but I can't imagine a situation in which Lindsay would say, oh, I found out that I bought this really, what I thought was a cheap stone, and I bought it anyway, and it turns out as a very valuable stone, but I'm going to invalidate the contract. I mean, maybe she would. Maybe I'm being pessimistic, but I can't imagine many buyers actually making good on that and giving and going back to give that valuable stone to the seller. Okay, So that is the end of chapter 6. I'm going to leave it there. When we get into class tomorrow night, we'll start with chapter 7. We'll get through that, and then we will move on to chapter 8 if we can, and I'll give you out some assignments that we'll be doing the next few weeks. So again, please write down any questions you have. If you don't get to this before class tomorrow night, the 14th, we will have an opportunity to cover and go over chapters 5 and 6 when we do a review for your test on chapters 5 through 8. Okay, so thanks again, everybody, and I hope you have a good night, and I will see you in class. All right, bye.